The first conversation that made me believe in my English. It was a bright morning in early spring. The sun streamed through the windows of the small café where I worked part-time, casting golden rays over the wooden tables and the colorful coffee cups. I was arranging pastries behind the counter when I saw a man enter, a foreigner. His hesitant glance around the cafe immediately caught my attention. It was clear he wasn't familiar with the place. I took a deep breath. This was it. My first chance to use English outside of my textbooks and phone apps. My heart raced, but I reminded myself of all the hours I had spent practicing. "You can do this," I whispered to myself. "Good morning," I said with a nervous smile as he approached the counter. "Good morning," he replied. His voice was kind, and his accent was gentle yet unfamiliar to me. He looked at the menu hanging above my head. "Can you recommend something?" For a second I froze. Recommend? What did that word mean again? Then, like a light bulb flickering on, I remembered. Meant to suggest something. My brain quickly scanned through my mental dictionary. "Yes," I said, trying to sound confident. "The chocolate croissant is very good. And coffee. Cappuccino is popular here." He nodded, his face lighting up with a smile. "Great. I'll take 1 chocolate croissant and a cappuccino, please." I couldn't believe it. I had understood him, and he had understood me. Carefully, I prepared his coffee, focusing on each step as if my life depended on it. I wanted everything to be perfect. When I placed the cup and croissant on the counter, he said, "Thank you. You speak English very well." Those words felt like sunshine breaking through a cloudy sky. "Thank you," I replied, blushing. "I am learning." "Well, you're doing great," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. He paused, then added, "I'm new in this city. Do you have any recommendations for places to visit?" This time I was ready. I told him about the park near the river, the old museum in the city center, and the evening market that sold handmade crafts. As I spoke, I felt my confidence growing. My sentences weren't perfect, but he listened attentively, nodding and smiling. When he left the cafe, I felt like I was floating. That short conversation had changed something inside me. For the first time, I believed in my English. It wasn't just words and grammar exercises anymore. It was a real tool I could use to connect with people. Discovering the city. The next day, as I arrived at the cafe, I saw him again. He was sitting at a corner table, a small map spread out before him. He looked up and waved when he saw me. "Good morning," he said, smiling. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I was wondering if you could help me again. I'm planning to explore the city today, and I don't want to miss the best parts." I felt a surge of excitement. "Of course. I can help," I replied. "Do you want to start with the park near the river? It's very beautiful this time of year." He nodded eagerly. "That sounds perfect. But would you mind showing me the way? I'm terrible with maps." My heart skipped a beat. Show him the way? I hesitated for a moment, then reminded myself that this was a chance to practice my English even more. "Sure," I said. I finish work at noon. We can go after that. At exactly 12:05, we were walking out of the cafe together. He introduced himself as Michael, a photographer traveling the world to capture unique moments and places. As we strolled through the cobblestone streets, he asked me about my life, my city, and how I was learning English. I told him about my evening classes, my favorite English movies, and how I practiced speaking with myself in the mirror. He laughed at that last part but said it was a smart idea. Talking to him felt surprisingly easy, like I had known him for a long time. When we reached the park, Michael was amazed. Cherry blossoms were in full bloom, their pink petals dancing in the gentle breeze. He took out his camera and started snapping pictures, occasionally showing me the shots. "You have an eye for beauty," I said, surprising myself with how naturally the words came out. "Thank you," he replied. "And you have a talent for making people feel welcome. It's not just your English, it's your attitude." His words filled me with warmth. As we walked further, he taught me a few photography tips, and I told him stories about the park's history and the people who visited it. Time seemed to fly by. After the park, we visited the museum I had mentioned the day before. Michael was fascinated by the old artifacts and asked me to translate some of the descriptions for him. It was a challenge, but I managed, and each successful translation made me feel more confident. By the time we returned to the cafe in the evening, I felt like I had lived an entire adventure. Michael thanked me for my help and said, "You should be proud of yourself. Your English isn't just good, it's useful. And that's what matters." As I waved goodbye, I realized that this wasn't just a day of practicing English. It was a day of discovering not just my city, but also myself, my potential, my courage, and my ability to connect with someone from a different part of the world. Reflections and new beginnings. Over the following days, I couldn't stop thinking about that experience. It wasn't just about speaking English, it was about the way I felt, confident, capable, and connected. For years, I had treated English as a subject to be studied, a mountain to climb. But now it felt like a bridge, something that connected me to the world beyond my small city. I decided to take my learning more seriously. Every evening, I reviewed my conversations with Michael in my mind, noting the words and phrases I had struggled with. I started carrying a small notebook where I wrote down new words, phrases, and expressions I wanted to practice. Watching English movies and listening to podcasts became a daily habit. But more importantly, I began to seek out opportunities to speak with tourists, with classmates, even with myself in front of the mirror. A week later, I saw a poster at the local community center. "Volunteers needed. City guides for tourists." My heart skipped a beat. Could I do it? The thought of leading a group of tourists and explaining the history of the city in English both excited and terrified me. But Michael's words echoed in my mind. "Your English isn't just good, it's useful." Taking a deep breath, I signed up. First few days were challenging. Speaking in front of a group was nothing like having a one-on-one conversation. I stumbled over words, forgot sentences midway, and felt my cheeks flush every time someone asked a question I didn't understand. But with each tour, I grew more confident. I learned to laugh at my mistakes, to ask for clarification when needed, and to trust that my enthusiasm could make up for my occasional linguistic missteps. One afternoon, as I was leading a group through the old market, I spotted Michael. He was taking photos of a street performer. When he saw me, his face lit up. "Hey, look at you guiding a whole group," he said, joining the tour. After the tour ended, we sat down for coffee. I told him about how our conversation had inspired me to push my boundaries. He listened intently, nodding and smiling. "I knew you could do it," he said. "You just needed to see it for yourself." As we chatted, he told me about his plans to create a photo essay about people overcoming challenges around the world. "You should be in it," he said. "Your story is exactly what I'm looking for." I laughed, thinking he was joking. But he wasn't. The idea of sharing my journey on such a platform was overwhelming but also thrilling. It made me realize how far I had come, from nervously serving coffee to confidently sharing my story. As weeks passed, I found myself becoming more comfortable with my English. I had signed up for the City Guide program, and every day I learned something new, whether it was a fact about the city, a historical anecdote, or a better way to explain things in English. Tourists I guided seemed to enjoy the tours, and my confidence continued to grow. But as much as I had improved, there were still moments of doubt and awkwardness. One afternoon, I was guiding a group of visitors from a nearby country, and during a discussion about a famous historical site, I accidentally mixed up two important dates. A couple of the tourists raised their eyebrows, clearly noticing the mistake. My face turned bright red, and for a brief moment I thought I had lost their trust. I quickly corrected myself, but the damage had been done. Conversation became awkward, and for the rest of the tour I felt like I was walking on eggshells. I had trouble concentrating, worrying that every word I said might be wrong. After the tour ended, I apologized to the group, feeling embarrassed. But one of the tourists came up to me, smiling. "You did a great job," he said. "Everyone makes mistakes, and we appreciate how passionate you are about this city. That's what matters." I was taken aback. For a moment, I had forgotten that it wasn't about being perfect, it was about sharing what I knew and connecting with others. That small moment of reassurance was all I needed to regain my confidence. Despite the occasional misstep, the number of tourists coming to my tours increased. They recommended me to their friends, and soon I was leading groups almost every day. I was still nervous at times, especially when the groups were large or when tourists asked me questions I wasn't prepared for. But I always reminded myself that this was part of the journey. One day, a group of French tourists came to my tour. I had been practicing some basic French phrases in case I needed to communicate with them. As we walked through the old streets, I tried to greet them in French, but instead of saying bonjour, I accidentally said bonjour. The word sounded awkward, and one of the tourists laughed. I felt my cheeks flush, but I laughed along with them. It was a small mistake, but it felt so embarrassing at the time. However, by the end of the tour, the same tourist who had laughed came up to me and said, "You know, your English is fantastic. We could understand everything you said. And the way you handled the mistake, well, that was impressive. It shows you're not afraid to laugh at yourself." Her words lifted my spirits. Every mistake, every awkward moment was just another opportunity to learn, to improve, and to become more comfortable with who I was in the process. It wasn't about being flawless, it was about being real and sharing something authentic with others. As time went on, I became more than just a city guide. People started to come to me for advice, for English lessons, and for help with their own language learning journeys. I became a mentor of sorts, sharing the same encouragement and patience that I had received during my own struggles with English. One evening, after a long tour, I sat down at a café sipping a cup of tea. Michael came in, his camera bag slung over his shoulder, and waved as he approached. "Look at you," he said, grinning. "You've become quite the expert." I chuckled. "I'm still learning, but I'm getting there." "I can see that," he said, sitting down across from me. "I'm so proud of how far you've come." "You know," I said, feeling a sense of fulfillment I hadn't realized before, "I think I've finally understood what you meant when you said my English is useful. It's not just about speaking it well, it's about connecting with people, sharing stories, and building bridges." Michael nodded. "Exactly. And your story is far from over." As I looked out the window, watching the sun set over the city, I realized that this was only the beginning. My journey with English, with self-confidence, and with connecting with others was just unfolding. There would still be challenges, mistakes, and moments of doubt, but I was ready to face them. Through all, every challenge was just another opportunity to grow. And as I continued down this path, I knew that one day I'd look back on all of this and smile, remembering the first conversation that made me believe in my English. Question for you. Have you ever had a moment that made you believe in your English skills? How did you handle your mistakes, and what did you learn from them? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Looking forward to reading your experiences, and we'll be back soon with the next chapter.